This screencast concerns the challenges that someone with type 1 diabetes has in regulating their blood glucose. And the focus is on what we would think of as open loop, which is known as sensor augmented pump therapy in the type 1 diabetes domain. After you see this screencast, you should be able to answer the following questions. What are typical clinical parameters? You should understand the insulin and meal dynamic characteristic behavior. Understand what typical performance metrics are, and then what is the effect of a missed insulin meal bolus. This diagram, again, takes off a previous screencast and shows what is known as sensor augmented pump therapy, where you have a continuous glucose sensor with signals available every 5 minutes displayed on a receiver, and a continuous insulin infusion pump and infusion set shown on the right-hand side. And it's really the individual that makes insulin decisions. And typically they will put in a basal or steady state rate of insulin that'll go through a several hour period. Sometimes there'll be different rates in the morning versus the evening. And then they'll give themselves insulin boluses to correspond to a particular number of carbohydrates in a meal that they're eating. This curve gives the steady state relationship between insulin delivery rate in units per hour and the blood glucose level. And this is from a simulation model that is discussed in a separate screencast. What we show here is that there's a desirable range of 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter that we'd like to maintain the blood glucose level in. And what you see is if you give too little insulin, then you're operating above the 180 milligrams per deciliter, and that'd be referred to as hyperglycemia, high blood glucose. If you give too much insulin, then you're operating below the 70 milligram per deciliter concentration, and that would be known as hypoglycemia. So you'd like to really operate in this range, 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter. Now, somewhat in the middle of that range, let's say that we desire to be at 120 milligrams per deciliter. For this particular individual, that corresponds to a basal insulin delivery rate of 1.06 units per hour. So at approximately 1 unit per hour, that would be 24 units per day of basal insulin. Then typically somebody would take another 24 units per day to cover all the carbohydrates in their meals. So when you give separate meal insulin boluses 3 or 4 times a day, that would add up to roughly 24 units. And so this individual would be expected to have a total daily dose of insulin of approximately 48 units of insulin. Now, someone's insulin sensitivity varies throughout the day. So this illustrates in the black curve is some nominal value, but if the individual is more sensitive, it would shift the curve shown in green to the left. And if they're less sensitive, it'd shift the curve to the right. So that somebody trying to regulate their blood glucose to 120 milligrams per deciliter, if they become increased or more sensitive to the left, then that would decrease their basal insulin delivery rate by 0.15 units per hour. But if they had reduced insulin sensitivity, shifting the curve to the right in blue, then they would actually require an increase of 0.22 units per hour of insulin. So that somebody may vary in their basal needs between roughly 0.9 units per hour up to close to 1.3 units per hour. Now, there are typical clinical parameters that are used by an individual to make insulin decisions. So one is if they're eating a meal that has a certain number of carbohydrates, then they need to know their insulin to carb ratio. And that's the number of units needed, insulin needed for a meal. And roughly you'll find 5 to 20 grams of carbohydrates are needed per unit of insulin. So that is an insulin to carb ratio would be 1 unit of insulin to roughly 5 to 20 grams of carbs. So for example, if their insulin to carb ratio was 1 unit to 10 grams of carbs, and they were eating a meal of 75 grams of carbohydrates, then the insulin needed would be 75 divided by 10, or 7.5 units of insulin to cover the needs of that size meal. Another clinical parameter that's important to know is the correction or insulin sensitivity factor. And what that is the expected glucose decrease per unit of insulin that's given. So this is roughly 30 to 70 milligrams per deciliter per unit of insulin, again, depending on the particular individual. So for example, if somebody needed to decrease their blood glucose level by 100 milligrams per deciliter, let's say they were quite high and wanted to decrease by 100, if they had an insulin sensitivity or correction factor of 50 milligrams per deciliter per unit of insulin, then they would need 2 units of insulin to decrease their blood glucose concentration by 100 milligrams per deciliter. Now notice that none of those clinical parameters actually took into account the amount of time. So here I have a dynamic simulation that's done. An individual is starting at 150 milligrams per deciliter, and they've given themselves 1 unit of insulin. And so we can see that over a period of time, they have a decrease of 35 milligrams per deciliter for that unit of insulin. Now notice that it takes almost 5 hours for that change to occur. Now below I've shown a low order transfer function fit, and you see that it's fit by basically a third order system. We have an integrator and then a second order dynamics. And we know we have an integrator because we didn't make a step change in insulin. It was the equivalent of an impulse, and yet that led to a new steady state change. That's an indication that you do have an integrator, and that's shown in the transfer function model. On this slide, we're showing a disturbance, and that would be a meal of 50 grams being ingested. And the way we simulated that was we assumed 10 grams per minute for 5 minutes, so eating the meal over a fairly fast period of time for 50 grams of carbohydrates. We had no insulin bolus that was given, so it's just the basal insulin that's being given. And you see that we had a peak of roughly 280 milligrams per deciliter at just before the 3-hour period after the meal. And what we find is in this red dashed line, a low order model that approximates that behavior is second order with a time delay of roughly 20 minutes. This slide shows the meal versus basal insulin that's typically expected out of an individual. That is roughly 50% of a total daily insulin dose is basal, and roughly 50% is meal insulin. So for an example of having a 10 gram of carbs per 1 unit of insulin, carb to insulin ratio, basically the inverse of the insulin to carb ratio, and to say the individual had a basal rate of 1 unit per hour for 24 units per day, then we expect the total daily dose to be roughly 48 units of insulin. But if they ate a 100-gram carb meal, then that might require 10 units of insulin. So what that means is a single meal is equivalent to 10 hours of basal insulin, that they would have to give themselves the equivalent of 10 hours of the steady state delivery just as a single bolus at mealtime to correct the meal. Admittedly, it's a reasonably large meal of 100 grams of carbohydrates. So contrast that with chemical processes. If you had that large of a change, you would typically want to have a small control valve for steady state and then a large control valve to handle disturbances, because your control valve would basically be open the order of 5 to maybe 10% of the opening at steady state, and yet when the disturbance entered, you'd need to slam the valve wide open. Well, there are drawbacks to this sensor augmented pump therapy or open loop control. One is individuals sometimes forget to provide insulin bolus at mealtime, and that increases their time in hyperglycemia, that is a high blood glucose condition. And also, tight control requires a diligent or constant glucose monitoring and insulin adjustment by the individual. On the next slide, I'm going to show the effect of somebody forgetting a meal bolus. And so in this simulation, we compare two different scenarios. So what I've shown in green is if somebody provides a bolus at mealtime for this 50-gram meal. And in blue, if somebody forgets to provide the bolus, and so all they have is then their steady state or basal insulin infusion rate. So you can see that then when somebody forgets to provide the meal insulin bolus, they spend a large amount of time outside that desired range of glucose concentration of 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter. But if you provide the correct insulin bolus, then you're only above that desired range for a brief period of time. Now in this slide, I show the effect of giving several different insulin boluses. And so these are carb to insulin ratios of 15, 20, and 10, the nominal being green of 15. But if we give the two different insulin boluses, you can see if we don't give quite enough insulin, then we have the blue curve, which has a higher peak and a little bit more time outside the range. If we give slightly more insulin, you have the magenta curve, and that brings you towards the low end of that desirable range. But the point is, we're just looking at the effect of different insulin bolus sizes. Now, there are a number of performance metrics that somebody looks at to tell if they're doing a good job of blood glucose concentration control. One of those is time and range. And what you'd like to do is spend most of your time within a 70 to 180 milligram per deciliter range. You want to spend very little in the hypoglycemic range of less than 70 milligrams per deciliter. And you desire little time in the greater than 250 milligram per deciliter range, which would be hyperglycemia. Another metric is the mean glucose level over the course of the day or some longer period of time. Another metric is the total daily dose of insulin that you're being given each day. And finally, a blood concentration measurement or a blood measurement known as the A1C, the glycated hemoglobin, would be done when you go in and have a blood test, perhaps during an annual physical or maybe a more frequent basis if you have type 1 diabetes. And an example would be a 7% A1C corresponds roughly to 156 milligrams per deciliter average blood glucose over a 2 to 3 month period. Now, there's a major effect of a single missed bolus, and we find teenagers in particular will forget to bolus for one of their meals during the day. This happens fairly often. And so I'm going to show a simulation of one day with 3 meals and a snack. And so breakfast is 75 grams, lunch 50 grams, dinner 75 grams, and a 40-gram carb snack later on. We're going to show the effect of a missed insulin bolus at lunchtime, but all the other meals and snacks will have an insulin bolus being given. And so we'll develop some plots of glucose as a function of time and then show a time and range table. So in this plot, you can see that since in both of these two simulations, the insulin bolus was given at breakfast time, which is time 0. And then lunch follows at a time of 5 hours. And the blue curve shows what happens if you forget to give an insulin bolus at lunchtime. You can see then you get a tremendous amount of time that you're spending above that desired range of 180 milligrams per deciliter. But the green curve shows if the individual did remember to bolus at lunchtime and the dinner time and the snack boluses. So simply missing one mealtime bolus at lunchtime gives you the blue curve, and you're really out of range then for a significant amount of time. And that's really what's shown in this table here, where in one line, I'm showing the effect of having all the boluses given. And the second line is if I have the missed bolus at lunchtime. And what you find is with that missed bolus, you have a higher mean value, 185.5 milligrams per deciliter versus 152.2 if you don't miss any insulin bolus. And then your time in range is only 45.3% of the time in the range of 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter. Whereas when you give all the insulin boluses, you spend 77.5% of your time in that desirable range. Then also, if you've missed that lunch bolus, you also have more time in the 180 to 250 milligram per deciliter range, and also in the 250 to 350 milligram per deciliter range. So to summarize, we've discussed hyperglycemia, which can occur if you don't give enough insulin, and hypoglycemia if you give too much insulin. We discussed clinical parameters, the correction factor and insulin to carb ratio, looked at the open loop behavior and developed low order models. We found that a meal insulin bolus may be equivalent to many hours of the basal or steady state insulin needs, and that one missed meal insulin bolus raises the mean blood glucose level. And then we looked at several different metrics, including the time in range, mean blood glucose, and total daily insulin dose.